Hallo aus Berlin.
Hallo aus der US-Hauptstadt Washington.
Hey.
Servus und Hallo aus Wien.
Ja, hallo.
Goedemiddag in Nederland.
Bonjour aus Senegal.
Γεια σας, χαίρετε, καλημέρα.
Ich bin Anne Dieckhoff, ich bin Korrespondentin für die nordischen Länder und lebe in Schweden.
Ich bin der Valhall Klaassen und ich grüße euch alle sehr herzlich aus der Hauptstadt der Ukraine, aus Kiew.
Aus Athen berichtet für die Taz Ferdi Batsoglu.
Aus Tunis, für die Taz.
Marhaba und Shalom aus Israel und Palästina auf dem Weg nach Berlin.
Fernverbindung.
Der Auslandspodcast
Der Taz.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our talk. My name is Sven Hansen. I'm the Asia desk editor here at Taz, and I'm also the host of Hansen's Asia Talk. And today is somehow special because it is the first Asia Talk I'm not moderating. I'm just hosting, or organizing, or co-organizing. And this is due because Felix had the idea and also was keen to moderate, and I'm happy that he's doing it. And also we are thankful to the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, who is co-funding this event, and therefore it will be now the turn of Nadja from the foundation to also give a brief introduction.
Yeah, good evening. Warm welcome on behalf of Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. I would like to extend the welcome of this evening to all of you. My name is Nadia Sharabi. I head the Asia unit at Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. I'm delighted that we have the opportunity to organize this exciting evening together with the Berlin Contemporary China Network, the Taz, and Hansen's Asientalk. For us at RLS, it is a core task to use our work in and on China to somehow contribute to a more diverse view of China in the German public discourse. Perceptions of China are shaped by stereotypes and a reproduction of the other. In today's political discourse, China is portrayed as a systemic rival, as something fundamentally different from us. At the same time, this image often remains superficial, or information about the country is met with a certain degree of suspicion. The COVID-19 pandemic has made it clear that anti-Asian racism is also shaping perceptions of China. Tonight, Ho-fung Hung and Daniel Fuchs will offer us insights into the historical origins of the image of China in the West, how that image is portrayed in today's debate, what we can do to overcome prejudices, and, which I find particularly fascinating, how China's elites might also be using these images to their own advantage. Thank you very much, Ho-fung. Thank you very much, Daniel. And thanks again also to Taz and Sven Hansen. All right, enjoy the evening.
Yeah, welcome from my side as well to the audience here and to all those who are joining us online. I would also like to thank Sven Hansen and the entire staff at Taz, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, the Böll Foundation, and the Berlin Contemporary China Network for allowing us to have this conversation today. Given the growing geopolitical rivalry between the US and China, Nadia already mentioned that, and given the fact that German and European political elites seem uncertain, but definitely divided on the question of how to approach the People's Republic of China, I personally think that today's talk could not be more timely. We talk today about Western narratives on China and its role in the world. And we are going to approach this topic through a conversation with Professor Ho-fung Hung on his most recent publication, The China Question, 8 Centuries of Fantasy and Fear, which was published just earlier this year with Cambridge University Press. Ho-fung, it's an honor to have you here in Berlin. Let me briefly introduce you to the audience. Ho-fung is professor in political economy in the Department of Sociology and the Nietzsche School of Advanced International Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. His research interests include global political economy, protest, nation-state formation, social theory, and East Asian development. Ho-fung is an internationally renowned scholar and author of numerous monographs, including, for instance, Protest with Chinese Characteristics, published in 2011, The China Boom, published in 2015. Most of you might know this book of Ho-fung. It has also been translated in a whole variety of other languages. City on the Edge, Hong Kong Under Chinese Rule in 2022. Clash of Empires, From Chimerica to the New Cold War, also in 2022. And in this year, not only the book that we're going to talk about today, the China question, but also forthcoming, I think in a couple of months, if I understand that correctly, another monograph entitled Greenback Empire, Global Dollar Dominance and the New Cold War. My name is Daniel Fuchs. I'm assistant professor at the Institute for Asian and African Studies at Humboldt University of Berlin and a member of the Berlin Contemporary China Network. Before we start our conversation, just one organizational remark. We will have roughly 40-ish, 45 minutes of conversation between me and Ho-fung here at the podium, and then we will open the floor for comments and questions from the audience. This means comments and questions are allowed from people here in the room, but also from the audience online. So for those of us joining us in the live stream, feel free to use the function that you have to write down comments, and we will pick them up here as well. I will say that later again. If you have a question and a comment, try to be short, precise, and usually your remarks should end with a question mark at the very end. So it should actually be a question. Ho-fung. As I said, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Your book is impressive in very many ways. You study Western narratives on China in the longue durée, going back to the 13th century. And I would like to quote two sentences of your book, which, by the way, is here. So this is how the book looks like for anyone interested. To quote you, you write, "In the West, the academic study of China has experienced recurrent pendulum swings between polar opposite views of naive idealization and racist contempt, from the age of the Pax Mongolica to the Cold War." And a bit later you write, "Such swings usually had little to do with changes within China. They were often driven by the changing political economy within Europe and Europe's changing geopolitical and geo-economic relations with China." At the start, since you spend such a long period of time in your book, can you summarize the book's core argument for me and the audience?
Yeah, thank you very much, Daniel, and thank you, Taz, and thank you, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, and all the audience here and online. And it's my real pleasure and honor to be here. So it is a daunting task, and the book covers 800 years in 10 minutes. But to start with a contemporary example, that my other works is about political economy. And by the way, there's one article that I wrote in 2016. It's translated into Germany. It is on the website of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. The article is called The Party of One. And there's English and German version. I talk about the contradictions of China development model and how China has the urge to export capital investment and export to other part of the world as a way to overcome its internal contradictions, and then how it will lead to inter-imperial rivalry like in the early 20th century, as Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg analyzed, and we read the article, and actually it aged very well, that it is actually things have been developing in the last 10 years or so according to what I anticipated in the article. So if you're interested, can take a look at it. It is in German as well. Our understanding of China, there's a lot of good academic work about China today in academia, but then we always still feel the kind of temptation to fall back on very centuries long, not even decades long, stereotype. And this stereotype about China or the Chinese system or Chinese culture has this kind of a swing between two extreme, between fear and fantasy. We have a lot of work on Orientalism from Edward Said on the Middle East, and a number of Chinese or China-oriented scholars talking about this Western view on China. But most of this previous work focused on the critique of the fear of China without paying attention about the fantasy. And then what I find is that the fantasy and the fear are two sides of the same coin that fit into one another. For example, there's a German historian, Jürgen Osterhemmel, who wrote a book, Unfabling the East. And he's not only talking about China, he's also talking about European thought, about other Oriental Eastern society. And then what he's saying is that 18th century European has a more positive view on China, so it's fabling. So established China and other Eastern civilization as a fable, as a kind of a positive fable. And then later on, when imperialism rise, this become unfabling the East, and then the view become more condescending and racist and things like that. And then in the very end of the book, he even said that actually the way out of it is to refabling the East. That is actually is okay to like fableize or even fantasize about the East so far as you are respectful. But it is, I critique this view in my book because what you see is that this kind of a positive fantasy and stereotype of China, when the situation in the West change, it will easily turn into a very negative fear and racist fear. One example is, I'm talking with Daniel before the talk, that it is like happening right in front of our eyes, that just in the last year, we see, at least in the US, I'm sure that in Europe as well, suddenly there's all this positive talk about the China model again, that we should learn from China. Like the German chancellor, after visiting China, coming back and saying that, oh, look at how hardworking these Chinese are. And in Germany, we talk about work-life balance and four days week, so we need to get rid of it. And of course, then something that I'm sure that many of the people in the West want to say but cannot say it for political reasons is that then it's so good to have a workforce that is not protected by union. Then you can drive them to work as much as you can. And it's interestingly in China, the young people you see on the internet and some overseas Chinese or Chinese young people in China, that they always complain about this work culture of like low life. And actually it is also a problem of Chinese economy now, as you see that even Chinese leader recognize this problem of China is so good at producing stuff, but at the same time the economy didn't have enough consumption to buy those stuff. So many companies are not profitable. They are forced to export the thing overseas and create all this trade conflict. And then the official scholar, even in China, government say that the way out is to boost consumption of the people, and then one way to boost consumption is that to make people work less and have more holiday to consume thing. Actually, exactly what China needs is not this kind of a work culture, but then you see this Western leader, after going back from China, they will say that, oh, it is great, let's copy this. And in the US, there's a lot of talk about this, like China tech paradise. China is a high-tech paradise now, that in AI, in high-speed rail, in EV, the electric vehicle, in solar panel, they all, and of course the rare earth, they're all competing very fiercely and successfully with the West, and West should all learn from China. So China is a kind of a high-tech paradise. It was only this year. But then you look back, you don't need to look back too far back, in just 2 years ago. You see this kind of Western journalistic, at least, and political representation of China when They talk about the China model. It is full of problems and it is in crisis, which is true because like the Chinese economy has been in crisis. Even the Chinese government is talking about all the problem, demographic problem, and also the economic slowdown and non-performing loan, and the real estate sector is the prime example. And just 2 years ago, we are all talking about the Chinese economic problem and crisis. And when we talk about China tech, and there's a recent article just published by a German scholar from the University of Cologne, Marianne de Bromberg, and she and the co-author published an article about the techno-orientalism, that when Western media, Western government and politicians talk about China tech, that it represents China as a high-tech dystopia. People talk about this social crediting system, that monitoring, face recognition, and control monitoring. So it's all true. But then back in a few years ago, when people talk about China, China is a high-tech nightmare, like a bad Hollywood movie about this, how the government is using this technology to control and monitor people. But now, like 2 years later, and right now, that when Western media, some Western scholars talk about China, talk about this high-tech paradise. The West should learn from it. So this radical shift happened right in front of our eyes in the last 2 years. There's nothing fundamentally changed in China, actually. That Xi Jinping and the policy and the CCP is very consistent. The policy is not like Trump nowadays, that the policy change every day. But then China policy is very consistent. It didn't change. But what changed that lead to this radical shift from the fear to fantasy is that now the US has a leader that many people are a lot happy about. And so it's not like Obama era or not like Biden era. Many people in journalism, in academia, tend to be more liberal than conservative, will be more comfortable with the previous administration and their policy on China, so that they are rallying around this force in the West to compete with China, to defeat China in technology and everything. So all the talk is about the fear. But then when the West, something happened in the West, that Trump got elected, and then he has his policy, and just in 1 year, as a reaction to our unhappiness to the US new policy and new government, that all of a sudden we turn this fear into fantasy. So it happened in front of our eyes. It happened so frequently, and in the beginning of the book, I find a quotation from Donald Trump in 2008. At that time, he was not serious in politics, but he came back from Shanghai, and then he is in the conference of all this real estate, and it's a hospitality industry conference. It is a hotel constructors and all these people, and then saying that we are hopeless in the US. I just came back from Shanghai. I see these people building stuff and pouring their dirts and everything into the river. And then I asked the guy, do you need environmental impact assessment? The guy in Shanghai, no, nothing. We just pour the thing into the river. And then Trump said, it is the way to do business. And while in New York City, I throw a stone into the Hudson River, I will get an electric chair. So it is the conception. And then another example is that around not 10 years ago, like 5-6 years ago, when in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn in the Labour Party has a chance to win election, that people are worried about it. And then one playboy tycoon in UK by the name of Lord Sugar, and then told the media, is saying like that if Jeremy Corbyn get elected, become the US Prime Minister, so let Britain rot under socialism and we all move to China. So it's all this kind of conception about China did everything right, including capitalism, and they are doing capitalism, free market capitalism, better than us in the West, because we are strangled by environmental concerns, strangled by socialism, strangled by redistribution, by the union. So China is the kind of a model of capitalism, the real capitalism. So we lost our way in capitalism. Let's learn from China. So this is very real, and then I find it in history that like in 19th century, when in Germany and elsewhere there was a romanticism movement, as a reaction to industrialization, to modernity. People are yearning for rediscover this spirituality and Christianity and religion that lost in modernity. And then German Indologist Friedrich Max Müller, who invented this like Indo-European language and import the swastika as a kind of an ancient Indian symbol to Germany. And then under his influence, and there's a sinologist, James Lax, we invent this theory about this Chinese ancient Christian. They practice Christian morality better than the West. So we lost our way in modernity, in industrialism, in materialism. So we should look east to learn the Christian way, and we discover our spirituality by learning from China. And for Max Müller, of course, is learning from India. But for James Lack, the first British sinologist in Oxford, saying that we should look at the Chinese classic to rediscover the lost Christian religion in our culture. So it is pure fantasy. And then it didn't happen because something going on in China, because in the 19th century, China was falling apart after the Opium War. But then yet, these European Orientalists still talking about China's superiority, let's learn from China. And then these talk about China being ancient, never changed over the decades, over the centuries. Later on, when the intellectual climate of Europe changed, lead to a huge reversal from this fantasy about a stagnant, unchanging China into a fear of this stagnant, unchanging China, that they are ungodly, they are ruled by Oriental despotism and things like that. So this kind of thing changed a number of times radically in history. And then the current example is interesting because it's happening right in front of our eyes.
Thank you very much for this very good summary of where you want to go with the book. Before I would like to turn to your arguments in a bit more detail, I would like to know about your motives in writing that book, because as mentioned earlier, to an international academic audience, you are first and foremost known as a critical political economist, focusing your research on China and its role in the global political economy. So what were your motives for writing this book, for turning to a different topic about Western narratives and Orientalist stereotypes about China?
Yeah, actually, that in the preface of the book, I mentioned the background of the book is that it is the book that I spent the longest period of time to write. It's like more than 25 years, almost 25 years, more than 20 years, because it was originally my dissertation topic. When I start my doctoral degree studies in the US with Emmanuel Wallerstein, when he was still around at that time in upstate New York, Binghamton, and he split his time between Paris and Binghamton at the time. So he was doing this structure of knowledge project. So I studied with him, and I would like to see this Orientalism scholarship, or area that developed into area studies in Western universities, how it developed. But then, for practical reason, that as a young doctoral student, and it is not advisable, and everybody will advise me against doing this as a dissertation topic because it's too big. It is intellectual history. As a dissertation, you need to find a very narrow focus, very concrete topic. And then I work on something else in my dissertation and put it aside. But I'm always looking into this issue in the background. So it is the background of the book. And then the motivation is that there's a lot of, in the 1990s, there's a lot of talk based on Edward Said Orientalism, but the discourse is always about the Middle East, and relatively few work is about China, and primarily because this cultural study critique is always focusing on this European negative view. And then the idea is that, the Western intellectuals always say these stupid, bad things about the East, China, Middle East, India. And the remedy, it seems to be like the German historian I talk about, like Jürgen Osterhemmel, is that So the remedy is that we just say all good thing about the East, and it is the solution, even though they might be stupid good things that to say. That my argument, and then I look into it, is this: it is about the epistemology of China studies. People tend to think that if you say bad thing about China, it is bad. If you say good thing about China, it is good. And I would say it depends, because if you say stupid bad thing about China, it is bad. It is equally bad if you say stupid good thing about China. The issue is not about whether you're saying good thing or bad thing, it is the stupidity that is the problem. If you are having sophisticated, very complicated and nuanced and pretty well-grounded argument, no matter whether you are criticizing China or praising China, that is good. Let's have a debate. But if you are saying stupid good thing or stupid bad thing, there's no debate, because the stupidity is like shutting off the debate. So I would like to look at this academic discourse of China that I find still influence our academic discourse and less in academic than in politics and culture. That is kind of strangling or stifling our understanding of China. And at the same time, that this Western discourse of China is not like in the 16th century, 17th century, and then the Jesuits, the Catholics, and then the scholar talk about China is just like it affect European policy toward China, but it didn't have a lot of influence on China. But in today's globalized knowledge system, what is written in the West will instantly being translated and incorporated by Chinese intellectuals, including the authoritarian government of China and elsewhere in the world. And it will shape the self-conception of the society and the political system of intellectuals. And then, as one part of the book is that now that in the 20th century, the authoritarian system, the authoritarian government of China from the nationalist government before 1949 is a right-wing authoritarian government, and then after 1949 is the Communist Party, is also authoritarian. Both government and their intellectuals very strategically use this Western stereotype of China, negative or positive, to take advantage of it and then to work toward their own advantage and to strengthen and to justify their political rule and their dictatorship. So it is something that we need to tackle with and to debunk. And so it not only about how Western academia and intellectual understand China, but also how the Chinese nation or the Chinese government or the Chinese people would understand the societies and create this discourse and narrative that can be more critical and more multiple and diverse.
Thanks a lot. I will get back to this issue of self-orientalization that you mentioned at the end. I don't want to make it too boring for the audience, but I do have a conceptual question for you as well. You already mentioned it. Central to your approach in the book is Edward Said's concept of Orientalism. However, coming from Immanuel Wallerstein and world system analysis, you expand your conceptual approach by at least two additional perspectives. You focus first in the book on macro political, economic and social changes in a global capitalist economy. And second, you also pay particular attention to the places where knowledge is produced and to the intellectual networks involved. For our audience today, can you briefly highlight the main insights that you gained from Said's concept of Orientalism? And second question, what do you additionally achieve by looking precisely at those macro changes and the shifting dynamics within the intellectual field?
Yeah, that is a conceptual question, but not necessarily boring. Concept can be exciting and entertaining. Like Edward Said, Orientalism is a very good example. And again, that because Edward Said focused on the Middle East, but if you actually read the details of Orientalism book, he also have this observation that Western conception of the Middle East By the way, the Middle East is a modern construction concept. It is like the Muslim world, the Arab world, and it also has this kind of a shift between fear and fantasy. But when they fantasize about the Middle East, that is one of the famous cover of the one version of the Orientalism book is like a naked woman with slick and all this kind of thing. It is very sexualized and feminized. So it is a kind of a projection of a kind of a sexual fantasy of the culture. But then he did observe this fear and fantasy cycle. But then because of the particular history of the relations between Europe and the Middle East, from the Crusade to the Ottoman Empire to more recent history, that is more conflictual. While in terms of China and relation with Europe, it didn't get into direct military conflict until the 19th century. So the relation is much less conflictual. So it has more room for fantasy. And this fantasy, of course, there is also this same thing about this kind of a very feminized and sexualized fantasy about China. If you read Marco Polo, by the way, that all the way until 19th and 20th century, that the term Chinese, Tatar, Mongol, they are used interchangeably. Like in the 19th century, when the US has this anti-Chinese exclusion act, the politicians, including like Teddy Roosevelt, and they mentioned that, we have to exclude Chinese migrants because we don't want Mongol invasion. So they make reference to this Mongol invasion. This fear of Mongol invasion is why I start with the 13th century. Is keep talking about, we invoke again and again. But then you read Marco Polo, it's a section about, of course, Marco Polo's book was popular in his time, partly because, not because of the accuracy, and we now know that his description are accurate only in retrospect after we know more about historical China. But then back in the 13th century, the book was popular because Marco Polo claimed that Kublai Khan, that is the Mongol ruler at the time, told him that he is ready to be baptized, to be Christians, which is, I'm sure, it is like fabrication. I'm sure that Kublai Khan didn't say that. But then Marco Polo made this claim. And at the time, Pope, the Vatican, the church has this kind of fantasy about having a powerful Christian force in the Far East. And then they will join hand with the European to crush the Muslim from two sides. So basically it is the policy. So they have been very actively to seek alliance with this far away supposed Christian, because there's this fantasy that the Mongols, where did they come from? They are the descendant of the three Magi's. That is the three wise men who visit Jesus as a baby. And then after that, they went back to the east, and then their descendants become the Mongols. So it is this fantasy, pure fantasy. But Marco Polo fit into this fantasy and saying that, oh, yeah, they are Christian. Kublai Khan told me to tell you, the Pope, to send some priests to help him convince his other noblemen to all baptize, become Christian. So this kind of fantasy never died, and the Jesuits in the 16th, 17th century from the Catholic Church revived this. So this Orientalism is very different from Edward Said's Orientalism, and partly this kind of claim that the Chinese is the fantasy about this China as an ancient Christian helped the European to feel hopeful in fighting with the Muslim, because they always fantasize these Far East Christian allies to join hand with Europe to help Christians. So this Muslim question is always there when they're talking about China. All the way to the early 20th century, the dictator of China, Chiang Kai-shek, in the nationalist regime, they play into this fantasy as well. That is interesting that internally within China, Chiang Kai-shek discourse is very fascist. Actually, before the Second World War, he consciously copied a lot of institutions that of the Nazi Germany to institute in China, for example, that he institutes a kind of a blue shirt society that model after the brown shirt of the Nazis and things like that. So he write a book and talk about this kind of people should obey with the leader and things like that. And he write a book even like the U.S. The critiques of U.S. policy of getting too close with Chiang Kai-shek is calling the book the Mein Kampf of China. So internally that Chiang Kai-shek is kind of a fascist leader, a strong leader. But then in the US, in order to secure US support of Chiang Kai-shek, first against Japan, then against the communists, he is like emphasizing he is a good liberal Christian. And all these US-China hands traveling, and like Henry Luce, who found the Time magazine, and they all have a missionary background. Either themselves they are Christian missionary, or they are from a Christian missionary family, like the Nobel Prize winner in literature from the US, the Pearl Buck, who wrote The Good Earth, and she is from a Christian family. So they all lobbying the Roosevelt government and by saying that Chiang Kai-shek is a Christian, and then it's good that because Christianity is losing ground in the US, we are engulfed by atheism and socialism and communism and all that. And then if we have a Christian nation in China as an allies, we will make Christianity great again globally. So that Chiang Kai-shek is like playing this game by pretending or emphasizing the Christian side, but he's never a real Christian. And under his regime, Christmas is not even a holiday in China or in Taiwan after they moved to Taiwan. So it is this kind of a very different formation regarding Western Orientalism about the Middle East and Western Orientalism about China. China, the fantasy part is always much bigger. Of course, another conceptual interesting thing is that I look into Karl Marx's works about China and India, and Max Weber work about China. They are all based on bad Orientalist sources. In Karl Marx, that he just talk about Indian society based on a few British colonial report, and then saying that China should be the same. That is, the society is based on self-contained village, communal village without private property, and then governed by Oriental despot. So he borrowed this concept of Oriental despotism from Hegel, Kant, and this long tradition. And in terms of Marx, it's very, very interesting because in the early works of Marx, he talked about Oriental despotism in India and China is a very negative sense, saying that that's bad because there's no history there, because the village has low private property, low conflict, it's all communal, and the village, self-contained village, a lot connect with one another. It is also in Weber. So they think that capitalism cannot develop spontaneously. It needs imperialism to break the door open. So it already done the job in India. Now it is doing the job in China. So it is good. So it is early. But then the later tried Marx reading, and he start to be influenced by the Russian populists and also German romanticism about this romanticized view about the self-contained village in which there's low private property. And then the Russian populists think that it can be a shortcut to socialism because there's low private property in the village. And there's a tendency towards socialism. And then Marx got into this in this like unpublished writing about Asiatic mode of production in the late 19th century. So it still continues today in a lot of Marxian analysis of China that this celebrate this, of course, Oriental despotism, and later used by another German sinologist, Karl Wiesvogel, who later went to the US and talked about this Oriental despotism as the origin of the totalitarian dictatorship of the Communist Party. But at the same time, many Maoist-influenced sinologists and scholars see this Oriental despotism, Asiatic mode of production, as a positive light, is a more efficient and shortcut to communism, people's commune and collectivization and the dictatorship of the one-party system. So it continues. It's not only a conceptual question, it is also a political question. And of course I can go on and on, but then it is the main thrust of the book.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not only the main thrust of the book. I would say it's the core strength of the book that you actually look, very far back in history and show with various examples how there are recurrent Orientalist stereotypes. You just mentioned basically a view from Marco Polo via the Jesuits to Karl Marx, right? So I think that really is a strength. I would like to give us all the opportunity to talk about one more example to understand the way of your thought in the book. As you outline in one chapter or two chapters actually, much of 20th century knowledge production about China, especially after the end of World War II, was tied to variants of Weberian modernization theory, right? So basically a theoretical approach debunked, very often by now, but still there, that aims to explain, as you write yourself, success and failure in modernization in terms of the presence or absence of certain cultural traits. I'm simplifying here, but according to this view, as you point also out in your book, Chinese traditional culture, this is a quote again, impeded modernization in East Asia, and the region's modernization could only be a response to an external stimulus that can dismantle the straitjacket of Chinese traditional culture and institutions. Maybe, as I said, taking this example of modernization theory in 20th century as another point in your argumentation, to what extent has this view been built on earlier historical China narratives as well as earlier scientific racist scholarship on China? Maybe you can explain this in a few sentences.
Yeah, in the 20th century or the late or mid-late 20th century, that is all this talk about the role of Confucianism. It's a very monotonic construction as a culture. Everything is Confucianist in China or in Asia. Scholars, let alone some politicians or commentator, try to explain everything in China or what they call the Confucian circle, including Korea and even Japan. But then people who know the nuance of the history of the region, you know that Japan is not exactly, it has Confucianist influence, but it has also a lot of other influence, Buddhism and Shintoism and all these other currents, and Korea as well, that they have a lot of different influence, including Buddhism and later in the early 20th century Protestantism as well. So they try to explain economic growth or problem in terms of this Confucianism, very monotonic view of Confucianism. That it all come from Weber, of course. And Weber is complicated. That I don't want to be too negative about Weber, not only because I'm in Germany now, but also Weber is indeed more complicated than most people think, because at least in modern social science, we only mostly focus on Weber Protestant ethic and how Calvinism helped capitalism. So it is Weber early work, but then in the last few years of his life, he gave a series of lectures about economic institutions and a lot of interesting stuff that is more materialistic or materialist view on the state formation of capitalist development. That is like culture is one part of it, not the whole of it. So it is very complicated. But in this early Weber view about using culture to explain capitalist growth, has been replicated in East Asia and in the early post-war era. Both the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party in Taiwan and in China, they adopt this kind of a very Weberian view about everything traditional, a bad culture. We have to eradicate all of it. And both the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party try to get rid of local temples and local religion, local practice, local communal organization, and things like that. See this as impediment to development, and they try to modernize the society in their own way. So this is very Weberian. But in the end, after the economic success became apparent, first in Taiwan and then in China, scholars in both places and also in the Western world start to, again, use the culture to explain why it is so successful. Like this kind of theory about it's actually Confucianism is a functional equivalent to Calvinism because it provides a kind of a good work ethic. to make people work hard and consume less. So it is a very, very convenient kind of argument, but then later on when things go well and people use culture to explain why things going so well, and then when things go bad, people also use the same culture to explain why things so bad, and in the end, so then this cultural explanation is pretty useless. And then I'm not saying culture is not important, but it has to be in combination with certain political, economic, institutional condition to make it work. And then culture is not monotonic, even Confucianism. So it is the problem of social science in the Western world is that when we do comparison, we are very unbalanced. When Weber talking about Western culture, he focused on Calvinism, a very particular sect of Protestantism, not even Catholicism, not even Lutheranism, very particular. But when he compare it with China, when he talk about Chinese culture, he's talking about Confucianism. There's no variation across time and space, just one monotonic whole. But then in fact, and I have spent a lot of time talking about this kind of internal variation of Confucianism, that is this kind of a person, Li Ji, that is in the 17th century Confucianist. He's actually, there's now more and more evidence show that he's not only Confucian, but he's also a Chinese Muslim. Because he from an area where there's a lot of Arabs in the medieval period doing trade with China, and he's descendant of those Arab, and is not sure whether he is Arabs or Persian, but definitely his great-grandfather must be from that region. And when he died, he tells his disciple to wrap him in a white cloth, so it seemed to be a Muslim funeral kind of practice. And then he's a Confucianist scholar, and then he write a lot of books that is very radical and talk about subverting the vertical hierarchy between parents and children, men and women, and he advocated a very radical egalitarianism of human relation, and some contemporary scholar of Li Ji even call him the Nietzsche of China. So because there's a comparability of his critique of Chinese morality and Nietzsche in Germany, in Europe. So that is all this kind of a very complicated variation, and also change over time, that it is being lost in all this discussion about Confucianism, and using Confucianism as a kind of a very simplistic explanation to explain China's success or failure, depending on your perspective. But then now the current Chinese government, as I cite in the book, during the COVID-19 pandemic, in the official media of China, there is a lot of talk about why China control the pandemic so successfully. It is in the early stage of the pandemic. Because we are collectivists, we are Confucianists, we have all this communalism that everybody won't question the authority when they tell you to not go out for a whole month, for the whole city. So we are so successful. Look at the Western country. Nobody listens to the government, that they do their own thing, so it is why so chaotic. So they are using this Confucianism argument and they say that it is why China is so successful economically as well. To explain this and to justify the policy. But in the end, that you know how it ends is that this zero COVID policy actually didn't work, and then people in China are protesting against it, and in the end it collapsed in chaos and a lot of death and a lot of cost. So this thing is still around, and then particularly promoted consciously by the Chinese authorities and official scholars, and there's still a huge temptation of the West to use this kind of a cultural lens to explain everything good or bad about China.
Yeah, this aspect of self-orientalization reminded me a little bit of the argument presented by Arif Dirlik in his work, who also did some very good studies on that aspect. Since I myself work at an Institute for Asian and African Studies, I would like to ask another question defending my field, so to say, in a little bit, because so far we have talked about the pitfalls of and downsides or negative aspects of academic knowledge production about China. However, in the book, you are also highlighting that the field of China studies, since about the late 1960s in the US, I think we have to differentiate between the development in the US and in Europe, but in the US since the late 1960s has, you argue, successfully undergone a process of de-orientalization. I would like to ask you for a short answer, because there's still a lot of questions on my list, but which factors have been central for such a development of a more nuanced, critical, and especially non-essentializing approach to China?
Yeah, there are a couple of factors, but one factor is that since the early 20th century, that China's scholars or scholars from China entering the field of sinology and Orientalist enterprise is very advanced compared to other fields like Indology and the study of Middle East for geopolitical and colonial reasons. In China, we see a lot of sinologists who have from China early on in the early 20th century. And also the Cold War and then the split between Soviet Union and China and then the Western world realignment with China work in a way that it dissolved this kind of view about China as a communist evil kind of talk, and then more left-wing critical view on China have a space to develop after Nixon visit China and after China still a communist country but aligned with the Western world. Of course, the student movement and an anti-war movement then in the 1960s also helped reshape the field, because a lot of scholars of China study from the 1960s onwards, because like East Asia is a place where Cold War is very hot. That Vietnam War, the first Korean War and Vietnam War. So in the East Asia in general, and China is the biggest part of it, actually this complication of the Cold War history then create more space for scholars from focusing on the region to put into more critical view, and a lot of scholars in China studies and Asian study, East Asian study in the 70s, 80s onward, they are look at their background, they are veteran of the anti-war movement and influenced by the student movement in the 60s and things like that. So these are all the factor that make, and actually, in fact, you look at Edward Said book that there's, I think it is afterward in one later edition, he said that I quote that sinology, China study, is the field that is de-orientalized faster than other fields. Thanks to this, he didn't elaborate, but I elaborate for him thanks to this very complicated history of China in the Cold War.
You already mentioned that the Orientalist essentializing frame of so-called Western versus so-called Eastern values, for instance, in terms of individualism in the so-called West and collectivism in the East, continue up to this day. This is not a part of your book, but I would argue that in Europe, one dominant essentializing frame is about the so-called democratic West versus the so-called autocratic China. And such a frame is also used to bolster a narrative about a supposed natural common interest between China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and the like. Would you agree and sort of put the same criticism to this simplistic frame? And what is, based on your research and your book, problematic precisely about positioning democratic versus autocratic in such an essentializing way?
Yeah, that is a very interesting observation that I agree that we allow still capture, even in academia. You see this kind of a China tendency to autocracy because of the long history, culture, and of course Oriental despotism, that this thesis has been all around, whether there's some deep-root history of this autocracy. But interestingly, you look at this, and it all originates from this Enlightenment era, from Montesquieu to Kant and Hegel and Marx and Karl Vogel, about this kind of, is in the so-called, I myself never use this word, but it is very common, the DNA of China is to have this kind of a despotism. But you look at the history of the concept of Oriental despotism, you look at Kant, Hegel, and even Karl Marx, and then when they talk about Oriental despotism, they think that the most Orientalist despotic place in Asia is India. They use India as an example because it's like isolated village, low private property, low individuality. So India very easy to be overrun by outsider despot from the Mughal Empire, the Mughal, and then the British. Actually, that I think Hegel and Kant and explicitly talk about this kind of if there's any hope for freedom in this Oriental society, that India has the least hope. China might have some hope. So it is the conception. But then what happened actually in world history is the opposite. India became the most successful democracy in the developing world in Asia. Of course, always have problem. Low democracy is problem-free. Then India almost went into fascism during the emergency in the 1970s, now with Modi. But then still they have a vibrant civil society and federal system, political party, intellectuals, and so much so that Amartya Sen write this book about, the book is called Argumentative Indian. That is that they are prone to argue and debate and be liberal. While China is for the time being and for the foreseeable future is most authoritarian. So you see this how unreliable this concept is. And at the same time, you look at the 1970s and 1980s, when the quest for democratization was exploding in Korea and Taiwan, and the dying authoritarian regime at the time in both places also resort to this Confucianism and Oriental despotism in the positive sense about it is in our culture DNA that Western democracy, liberal democracy didn't fit us. If we try, it will be a disaster. Our economy will collapse, and then our economic success is attributable to this authoritarian system. But then in the end, they did democratize successfully, and then this democratization didn't affect the economic power. That actually they did even better after democratization. And then and the democracy, even you look at some index measuring the level of the check and balance and civil society vibrancy and things like that, Korea and Taiwan is actually ranked higher now in some traditional Western democracy that is experiencing democratic backsliding. Of course, it's not that their society is totally westernized, become Western individualism. There's some study about, for example, the Taiwan and South Korea successful experience in COVID-19. It's not like in authoritarian China, they use a heavy hand of the state to just keep everything at home. But then Korea and Taiwan did resort to some communal trust and technology and then government efficiency, and with a combination of all to create a kind of a very successful outcome in containing the virus and without compromising people's freedom. So it is all this example showing that this kind of autocracy versus democracy is very false, and it mostly used to justify the certain system. And when the system changed, people will change their mind and then use the same culture to explain something else very different. So this kind of Western autocracy, Western democracy versus Eastern autocracy doesn't stand up to empirical history.
Reading your book, one might become, to some extent, even more pessimistic about sort of the future of geopolitical and geoeconomic relations when it comes to how we view the world and narratives about the East or China. Because essentially, what we are confronted with, you argue in the book, is lasting popular Orientalist narratives about China in Europe, in the US, and on the other hand, in China itself, sort of a use of exactly these essentializing tropes and stereotypes to bolster legitimacy. We've already established that in your analysis, academic knowledge production is part of the problem, or historically has been part of the problem. But my final question to you is, what can today academic knowledge about China contribute to actually overcome the still very, very dominant stereotypes that we see today about China?
Yeah, a quick response is that there are two things that make this de-orientalization very fragile regarding China. And and then we need to be conscious of this obstacle and try to overcome it, try harder. One obstacle is in Western society itself, that proliferation and popularization of social media. I'm old, so I'm used to reading long stuff. But then the younger generation, I know that it's like reading shorter and shorter stuff. You look at social media, first it's blog, then it is like Facebook, and then Twitter, and then Instagram. So it is the number of words is fewer and fewer. And now it's like TikTok is like, I'm not even talking about the security and all this issue, but this TikTok and then Instagram and Facebook imitate is try to make people feel that they understand the world by watching this like 5-minute clips. I see this kind of a TikTok history, like 5 minutes Roman Empire, 5 minutes. So it is short form of knowledge. It's like it is good if you take it as an introductory knowledge, and then after this you dig deeper and read big books about this topic. But then most people don't have time, and then just watch this 5 minutes Roman Empire and think that they understand Roman Empire. And 5-minute China, I'm sure that there's a lot of this kind of stuff there. And at the same time, this I have to comment, like media like TES, they have low paywall that people can get into the in-depth report about things free. But now more and more media, it's like you only see the headline. And the editor usually put it in a very sensational way. But then usually the text, the analysis, and the report is much better. But then you need to pay to get it. And people, after knowing that you have to pay, then they give up. So people know about the world by just looking at this headline. So it is this kind of a media situation in the West that make us like more prone to this simplistic view of everything, let alone China. And at the same time, China, because it is a very efficient authoritarian system, and as I said, that they are consciously promoting a lot of narrative, simplistic narrative that help its authoritarian rule. At the same time, they're very efficient in screening out narrative and selecting which scholars can visit China and then do research in China, who cannot, and then so it encourages some kind of self-censorship and consciously or unconsciously and inevitably help promoting the narrative that didn't at least conflict with the Chinese official narrative. So we need to look harder in this situation, that don't pretend or don't assume things are monotonic as much as the government of China try to us to believe. One example again is COVID-19. Then when the Chinese government is promoting this narrative about, because we are so submissive, we are so collectivist, so we so trust the government, so it is so successful. And at that time, a lot of Western commentators, even scholars, we iterate this narrative. On the one hand, they are very unhappy about the government, and so look, China is so successful, we are such a failure. And for all kind of reasons, help reproduce this Chinese official narrative in the West, saying that we should learn from the West, learn from China. But in the end, if we look harder on the social media and internet chatting, and all this undercurrent, you know that actually the Chinese people and young people, and they're all very unhappy about the Chinese policy. This is why all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we have this white paper protests that's so widespread that the party fear that it will spread to become more serious political crisis, so that they compromise and yield to the popular pressure to open up and cancel the zero COVID policy. But then before that happened, nobody noticed it. But actually some people look hard enough will actually find this kind of here and there evidence of this dissent underneath. So this also the same is the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe. After it collapsed, we know that actually there's a lot of dissent and underground thing going on. But only you look harder during the time, otherwise you won't find it, and suppose that everything is monotonic. So in terms of the look at China, we need to really, it is hard, but then we need to dig deeper and look harder and very conscious about all these limitations when we discuss and talk about China.
Then let me add one really last question here. My impression is that with regards to Germany or Europe at large, one problem maybe is that academic knowledge production seems to have relatively little impact on popular stereotypes about China. And this includes media reporting. We are here at the Taz. I take Sven Hansen not in this group of people, but in general, media production also, journalistic reports about China also reproduce or might reproduce those stereotypes. So my question is, would you say that sort of academics, critical scholars should intervene much more in such debates? Is that a way forward? Should you go on produce TikTok videos and so that they are put next to China maxing channels? Is that the way forward? What are more specific strategies? Because as you rightly said, I mean, those younger people who are doing China maxing at the moment, they might not read a book like this spanning back to the 13th century, right? So what to do?
Yeah, having more venue like test talks like this, that I think academic public-facing outreaching is very important. That I'm less familiar with the European university system. In the US university system, once upon a time that this kind of activity is discouraged. We lead to like publishing scientific journals, only that counts, and then also journals that has certain metrics and with certain index and impact factor, all that things. So it's discouraged. It doesn't add to the credit. That it doesn't carry a lot of credit. It's public-facing work. But now it's changing. A lot of people think that in this, one reason why we have a democratic backsliding is because this scholarship and public discourse is too segregated. And more public-facing this activity should count toward hiring and promotion of young scholar and old scholar alike. And so this is to be encouraged. And I think that has something to do with the evaluation system of the university, that they should actually value these kind of activities more. Not necessarily, and it is one of that like scholar making TikTok video or a scholar having this different kind of public engagement is very important. But because of the last half century of academic ivory towerization, that they encourage the kind of a closed door kind of circuit and discourage public-facing outreach, and now it leads to change in this situation, not only about China, but about all kinds of issues.
Then I guess let's hope that we don't need Trump here to change the evaluation system and the view on public engagement. With this, I would like to open the floor for comments and questions. We have a microphone in the room, and again, to the audience online, please feel encouraged to ask questions as well.
Yeah, thank you very much for a brilliant talk and great questions. I'm interested in the impact of China images on social sciences. You mentioned we are in Germany, you mentioned Max Weber, and so we had different receptions of Max Weber over time. And I'm wondering, I did not really do any deep research on this aspect, but when looking into the dynamics of changing China images and this pendulum from positive to negative and back again, then I think this has also something to do with the relation. I was just looking from the relations between Germany and China, not the whole global perspective. And so I had the impression that in times when China seems to be more strong, then the image is bad. And in times when China seems to be weak, it was the other way around. So I don't know whether you did some more analysis on this aspect. And yeah, thank you.
Do you want to answer to that? Yes.
Yeah, the quick answer is it depends. For example, the shift from positive to negative way, conception of China during Enlightenment in the 18th century, it has something to do with this relative economic and political power, at least the conception of it between China and Europe. But more important factor is actually the internal politics of Europe that shaped the view on China from positive to negative. I mentioned about the rise of Romanticism in Europe, that in 19th century when China was falling apart and Europe was becoming an imperialist powers, even at that time that the scholarship on China is full of positive fantasy. It has something to do with the Romanticism, and then these people identity crisis about the loss of spirituality, religions, and unhappiness about materialism, industrialism, so let look east. So it's a bit like New Age in the 20th century. That's like look to east to we discover this lost spirituality. So it doesn't necessarily reflect the relative power of China and Europe. And then in the 18th century, when in the early 18th century, that all this positive view about China book cover actually is based on a kind of in about 1700 that the royal household of the French monarch, the Louis XIV, actually commissioned a series of tapestry carpet called it the story of the Emperor of China, to project this very perfect image of the monarchs and centralized power. So the China image was used to promote absolutism, monarchy. And then Voltaire was hired by Frederick the Great, and then to talk good thing about China and then good thing about centralization. And Leibniz actually, when he had I think it's the Prussian Academy of Science, also do this thing about idealizing the China monarchical system. So that has something to do with what is happening in Europe just right now. That China economically is a heavyweight, but then it also is encountering a big problem that even the Chinese government itself is talking about. There's a tough job to solve this problem. But again, that because of what is happening in the Atlantic relation between Europe and US now, that we suddenly have a more positive view on China. So this is the recurrent theme of the book. This shift from fantasy and fear is maybe indirectly related to the balance of power between China and Europe, but at the same time it is more influenced by what is happening within Europe.
Okay, we have another question here.
Hello, yeah. Thank you so much for the conversation, really inspiring. My question here is, like, from my expression, my, how to say, understanding is more or less about how post-colonialism, like how you actually interpret that in terms of the Chinese context. Because from, when you say Western, like, how you define it is really big word. Like Europe is Western compared to China, American also Western. And I check a little bit of your background, also from Hong Kong, right? And also just from your name, like I come from Mandarin, kind of like Beijing, kind of China, mainland China. So that sort of kind of political context is also different from Hong Kong. Because before Xi, before also pandemic, we actually invited a lot of Western, how to say, in terms of culturally, like you also mentioned before, a lot of cultural impact of China, but during the 2010, sort of before Xi, Hu Jintao, that period, like China inviting a lot of Western, like a European famous architect, artist to install their work in Beijing, in central Hong Kong, like a Ren Kuhas and also Gomle's sculpture in the central Hong Kong. So there is a lot of kind of, how to say, post-colonial field in terms of how central kind of mainland China trying to present China as an international image, and how you interpret if that is actually a post-colonial kind of trend in that development, and if how you distinguish that concept in compared to modernization and also westernization. Sorry, yeah, maybe a big question.
Yeah, generally, a quick response is first, I use the West as a kind of out of convenience, and if you actually read the book, I distinguish like the Dutch representation of China and French representation of China. Even French is not monotonic. I spent a lot of paragraph talking about how the aristocrat, local aristocrat, for example, Montesquieu is the kind of is what people now call this aristocratic opposition to absolutism. So he is the head of the Parliament of Bordeaux. So it's a local against the French king, centralizing. So you need to see this kind of a political context. You're right that the political context is important. That like the people aligned with the centralizing monarchs like Voltaire and Leibniz and view on China and the aristocrat. There's a reason that why Montesquieu invent these concepts of Oriental despotism, because they are fighting their battle within France that against centralization and want more feudal decentralized rule. So that is like, and Dutch, then the Calvinists and the Jesuits, even within the Catholic Church, the debate about China is along Jesuits, Jansenists, Franciscans. So there's no one unified West as there's no one unified China or Confucian sphere. The PC era that you mentioned is an interesting phase of China that now, unfortunately, that in terms of narrative and academic discourse, it is trending toward more and more closure. I always take this example of myself as a kind of a manifestation, because my major book about Chinese political economy of development, the China Boom, Why China Will Not Rule the World, it is a subtitle my editor because they think that it sells the book better. And then many of my colleagues in the West who have hope about China ruling the world disagree and think that you are wrong, China is going to rule the world, and then your subtitle is Why China Will Not Rule the World of the book is wrong. But in the end, in 2000, the book was published in 2015, and then within 1 year, actually the state-owned major publishing house in Beijing, there's CITIC, Zhongxin, translate the book into simplified Chinese. And then they used the subtitle of the book, Why China Will Not Rule the World, as the title of the Chinese version. So in that time that I know that I interact with a lot of scholars back then in Beijing, and then there's kind of the debate within the Chinese intellectual circle about whether China should be so ambitious to run things, and some major intellectuals still don't agree that China should be that proactive in running things, because running things is costly and also risky. China should continue the Deng Xiaoping era policy of laying low and focusing on internal development for at least for a longer period of time. So it is in this context that they translate my book and then use my book in certain way. So I can see through this interaction, there is also this diversity, overtly, openly diversity of views back then. But nowadays, I think it is still there, some space in here and there, and people are trying to say things in a more subtle way. But then it's comparatively less so. And I'm not sure about the question about post-colonialism, because one background that I didn't talk about of the book is that in the 1990s, we are all very energized students who craving for new theory. We read Foucault, we read not only Eversye, but Homi Bhabha and Spivak, and all these kind of post-colonial work. But in the end, I think it is myself, I'm very much against this postmodernism and postcolonialism, ratifying everything. Kind of, I become a die-hard political economist with a kind of a cultural take on it. So it is my personal position. This is influenced my thought more than my upbringing in Hong Kong. That is my dissatisfaction with post-colonialism. So I have been a big fan of the late Jürgen Habermas, that actually is like who tried to defend modernity in all these craziness of postmodern excess in the 1990s.
Well, thank you both very much for this conversation, the organizers as well. I have just a very short question. Like you talked a lot about the ways in which Western changes their way to see the images and the stereotypes about China. I would like to know what's the attitude of China towards that. Actually, is China, in your historical reconstruction of these stereotypes, has China ever tried to change that in a way, or in a way so to understand as well what can be the future positions of China about this subject?
Yeah, on the one hand, that the political elite from the right and the left, as I said, that the right-wing dictators before 49 to a communist government after 49, they are very consciously taking advantage of some of the stereotypes and select the stereotype that they think is helping to justify their system and their rule. So they are, on the one hand, they are doing it. On the other hand, there's another thing that somebody need to write another book about, but there's already some in the literature about Occidentalism instead of Orientalism. That is this Chinese or Asian conception of the unified monotonic Western world. So it is the two sides of the same coin that you see from the government officials to the dissidents in China and elsewhere. Their view on Western societies are also very monotonic and full of stereotypes. Some are thinking that, so it dates back to the early 20th century in the May 4th movement. And in fact, one interesting chapter of it, and the Communist Party of China is part of this kind of a grow out from this radical anti-traditionalism and total westernization that in the starting in the 18th century and 19th century and early 20th century, and it is some Orientalist thinker or racist thinker think that China was stagnant because of the language system. That at that time, this scientific racist view of the brain is very mechanical, that you have certain capacity. And you spend most of the time memorizing characters, meaning that you have less capacity to reason. So there is the theory, and then they have this view about abolishing the Chinese language. The Chinese character is a way to go. Then people can free up their brain and then to do more logical thinking. But of course, that is ridiculous from today's standpoint. We now know that the brain works in not a kind of a zero-sum way. Actually, you learn more complicated language, help wiring your brain, and then will facilitate your other mental activities. So learn Chinese actually help you reason better, actually. But the view of the 19th century is this way. And then the Chinese Communist Party adopt this view. So the language reform program of the Communist Party, that they only succeed in halfway, that is simplify the character. But the original radical proposal is to abolish Chinese characters altogether and turn it into an alphabet-based, pinyin alphabet-based language. So it was the May 4th radical, anti-traditional, everything Chinese should be thrown into the dustbin of history. And then early communist writer like Lu Xun and talking about this everything. So they are actually copying this Western racist view about China, and today's a lot of Chinese dissidents also have this kind of view, and of course, then and other Asian countries also have this view. For example, you go to South Korea, they still celebrate a guy who invented the Korean alphabet. make sure that Korea no longer need to use Chinese characters. And you go to the museum underneath the big statue in the Guanghuamen, and then they still say that thanks to him that we have the alphabet, we no longer need to use Chinese characters, so it is better for mathematics, logic, and everything else. But of course, it's nationalism as well, that they don't want to continue to use Chinese character. But this is very common view, and then it's adopt from Western or Orientalism, racist even, that kind of a thinking, and even the Chinese Communist Party in its early days cannot escape from it. So it is very, very, very long journey for us to overcome this kind of a long problem.
Thank you very much, Ho-fung. There's definitely more questions, but we are at the end of our time. I'm sure that Ho-fung is still around for a little bit, so at least those of you who are here and not joining us online, feel free to approach Ho-fung if you have any further questions. And since we've been talking about this the whole evening, get a copy at your local bookshop of Ho-fung's new book. It is... I can really recommend this book to all of you. Have a nice evening, and thanks again, Ho-fung.
Yeah, also many thanks to both of you, and also for you for coming here. I think I have to read more books. That is one of my takes. No, I think it was quite... how to say, quite encouraging and quite interesting, and also I learned a lot. I also want to thank the TATS team for helping organizing this, for documenting it, and for the technical support. Of course, thanks again for Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. I hope you stay in contact with TATS Talks and Hansen's Asia Talk. I think usually we now get another, this will be the following talks. Also, as you might be aware already, on April 25th, we have our yearly congress called TATS Lab. So you have a lot of discussions there as well for a whole day, here in the building, on the upper floor, outside in the park, on the street. So we have a full day of discussions, and you can also be here in person, but also seen in the stream. Also, if you still want to follow up what we did today, you can also still watch it on YouTube. It will be stored for quite a few years, I would say. You can also recommend it to your friends. Thanks again, and you can still drink a beer outside or talk to each other. Many thanks, and again to both of you.